Very good. Okay, Marcus, you're going to introduce me, are you?
Você gostou, Anne, da trilha sonora específica para você?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, it made me feel very homesick for Rio.
Boa tarde a todos, sejam bem-vindos. Mais um evento do Tiaços, hoje num horário diferente, 13h. E a gente está aqui hoje com a querida Anne Casement. Anne, um grande prazer receber você conosco, no nosso grupo. Anne, que eu acabei de descobrir que já esteve no Brasil 6 vezes. Conhece o Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, Brasília, Foz do Iguaçu. Então, é íntima do Brasil. Isso nos dá uma satisfação a mais, uma alegria a mais em recebê-la. Anne, vou te apresentar formalmente, como de costume. Anne Casement é professora da Academia Oriental de Psicologia Analítica, é psicanalista, licenciada pelo Estado de Nova York, baseada em Londres, e membro de vários órgãos profissionais, incluindo a Associação Nacional para o Avanço da Psicanálise, a Sociedade Britânica de Psicologia e a Sociedade Internacional de Neuropsicanálise, da qual ela é membro fundadora. Atuou por muitos anos no Comitê Executivo da Associação Internacional de Psicologia Analítica, como também no Comitê de Ética, presidindo este último por 2 mandatos. Atua como analista, supervisora, palestrante, professora em vários países do mundo, incluindo Brasil e México, e atualmente trabalha no Japão e na China, este último a convite do professor Hyun Shen, que vai estar conosco daqui a 15 dias aqui no Tiaços. Tá? Ela também contribui para a revista The Economist e revistas profissionais em todo o mundo, e faz parte de seus conselhos editoriais. Autora de muitos artigos, resenhas, capítulos de livros, e produziu 8 livros, os últimos dos quais Integrando a Sombra, sendo sincero no mundo, que será publicado pela Tex AM, editora. A Anne tem vários livros publicados, editados, trouxe alguns para mostrar para vocês. Who Owns Jung? É um belíssimo livro, muito interessante. Um dos meus favoritos, pós-junguianos hoje, artigos principais na psicologia analítica contemporânea. Gosto muito desse livro, Anne. E também A Ideia do Luminoso, Perspectivas Junguianas Contemporâneas e Psicanalíticas. Esse ela editou junto com David Tacey, que também já esteve aqui no Tiaços. Anne, um prazer te receber, uma grande alegria ter você conosco para poder escutar suas ideias, suas experiências, sua bagagem profissional. Para nós é um grande orgulho e uma imensa satisfação. Sinta-se em casa. Obrigado.
Thank you so much. I'll start with my title. The Savage Mind, Complex Psychology versus the Anthropological Gaze. Abstract. The focus of this presentation is on the shadow of C.G. Jung's vision of creating a complex psychology, which has been partly prompted by an open letter from Andrew Samuels et al. In the process of trying to create an all-encompassing psychology of complexities, Jung aspired to bringing the sciences and other human endeavors together under the heading of complex psychology. This laudable vision was overshadowed by his usage of discredited terms such as participation mystique, which was appropriated from anthropology, Kant being the first to use the latter term in its modern sense. Needless to say, Jung's dream of a science never came to pass and was instead realized by what is known as cybernetics, the new paradigm that incorporates the sciences and social sciences. This had its origins in the thinking of the MIT mathematician and philosopher Norbert Wiener, encapsulated in an accessible book from 1948 titled Cybernetics, or Control and Communications in the Animal and the Machine. Another objective of this presentation is a revisiting of my dissertation on the similarity and differences between Jung and Claude Lévi-Strauss, who was the French creator of the discipline of structuralism, as well as an anthropologist who did his fieldwork in Amazonia. Preamble. I have been critically appraising Jung's appropriations from the social sciences over many years, this presentation being the latest in a long line of descent from past cogitations on the shadow of that undertaking. One reason for revisiting this now is in part related to an open letter from Andrew Samuels et al. That is online for anyone to read, which was also published in the British Journal of Psychotherapy, issue 34, 2018. This open letter is a response from its signatories to Fahad Dalal's article published 30 years before in the BJP, titled Jung a Racist. This was an accusation made against Jung of prejudice with regard to, quote, persons of African and South Asian Indian heritage. The open letter goes on to charge the analytical psychology community of remaining silent in the face of these accusations against Jung, claiming that his views have led to, quote, de facto institutional and structural racism being present in Jungian organizations, unquote. The statements quoted above were, to a certain extent, corroborated by my recent experience in the course of attending a presentation at a Jungian organization for a lecture on borderline psychosis linked to participation mystique. As anticipated, the speaker appeared completely unaware of the derogatory implications inherent in the term participation mystique, much beloved of Jung himself, which, as in this instance, continues to be a staple concept of some analytical psychologists up to the present time. On that particular occasion, when the speaker came to the end of the presentation, I pointed out the negative aspects inherent in Lévi-Bruhl's concept of participation mystique, namely that it denigrates what the latter called primitive mentality by claiming it is based only on mystical participation, which is incapable of separating out from other objects in its environment. These claims appeared in Lévi-Bruhl's books, How Natives Think and the Mental Functions in Inferior Societies, whose titles alone are indicative of his approach. The main thrust of which was that, quote, primitive mentality deals with reality in a pre-logical and mystical state of participation, in contrast to the logic and reflection to be found in what he termed a scientific mentality. On the above occasion, the speaker showed no interest in what I have to say, so that I tried again to spell out briefly the derogatory assumptions underpinning the term participation mystique. Once more, this was met with disinterest on the part of the speaker, and the chair told me curtly that I had made my point, an obvious attempt to get me to shut up. Throughout, no other member of the audience displayed interest in, nor any apparent comprehension of what I was saying, despite the fact that the International Association for Analytical Psychology, the IAAP, set up a diversity working party in 2016 to look into the issues raised by the signatories of the open letter. I have always been immune to peer group pressure to remain silent when I encounter what I deem to be questionable behavior on the part of colleagues. a trait that unfortunately appears to be quite rare in groups where the herd instinct prevails, even amongst the so-called individuated. In addition to the actions of the IAP, its group members themselves need to develop greater sensitivity in relation to their own members propagating derogatory terms that are misrepresentations of traditional cultures. Lost my place, sorry. I am putting this forward as an all too common example. Oh, I think I've lost my place. I'm very sorry about this. Yeah, that's fine. I'm putting this forward as an all too common example of group shadow at work in psychoanalytic organizations, despite detailed ethical regulations that are in place, some of which I've been responsible for creating and implementing in the past. It is a futile exercise to install ethical procedures at these institutions if the membership at large remains unaware of them and the concomitant need to live up to what is enshrined in those documents. I wish to stress that this account of the aforementioned event is in no way meant to be an accusation of actual or conscious prejudice against other cultures, but is instead an example of rigid disinterestedness that could open the way to the state of affairs spelt out in the open letter and to what Edward Said scathingly referred to as otherness. The next title, Shadow of Psychoanalytic Training Organizations. The above lends itself to a brief account of the unquestioning way that a large number of psychoanalytic institutions around the world administer their programs in relation to training candidates. For a great many years, several colleagues at the IAP, including Michael Fordham, James Astor, Jean Knox, and myself in London, as well as colleagues at the IPA, such as Otto Kernberg and Glenn Gabbard, have been critiquing the cultist dogma that passes for theoretical training practiced by many of these institutions. A searing account of this kind of quasi-religious indoctrination is encapsulated in Unfree Associations, Douglas Kirsner's anthropological survey of 4 psychoanalytical training societies in the USA. Its pages are filled with the authoritarianism and dogmatic input that training candidates have to survive in order to qualify as psychoanalysts. It is long overdue for these trainings to open their doors to diverse theoretical and practical approaches from other psychoanalytic, psychotherapeutic, and counseling entities, let alone to disciplines in the sciences and social sciences. Participation Mystique is the heading of the next section. To return to Participation Mystique, as the incident described above and centered around usage of that discredited term, I shall now set out a brief account of its historical record. In doing so, I aim to show the reason why Jung linked ideas from the social sciences, in particular anthropology and sociology, with some of his formative thinking in analytical psychology. These attempts on his part arose out of the fact that, quote, in his understanding, there was no field of human endeavor that was irrelevant for psychology. Consequently, there was no clear delimitation of the provenance of psychology, unquote. That's from Sony Shamdasani. In pursuit of this quest, Jung's appropriations from the social sciences are often deemed on my part to be flawed, though in evaluating them as such, it seems fair to acknowledge the teleological vision that lay behind them. To return to the concept of participation mystique, it was invented by Lévi-Brühl as a way of postulating a special primitive cast of mind to explain pre-logical, another of his inventions, beliefs, as well as the fact that primitives went about in a permanently mystical state. This primitive mentality was viewed by him as irrational, affective, non-cognitive, and non-conceptual, and resulted in a distinct difference between them and us. The notion of participation being central to this enterprise. All of these aforementioned attributes are indifferent to the law of non-contradiction, which I'm sure you all know from Aristotle. Levi-Bruhl was a philosopher, not an anthropologist, who grafted philosophical theories onto existing ethnographies. Several on-the-ground anthropologists who had actually lived among these so-called primitives objected strongly to Levi-Bruhl's misuse of existing ethnographies. These included Robert Lowy, Bronislaw Malinowski, and Paul Radin, the latter two of whom were definitely known to Jung. He even wrote a commentary on Radin's work on the Winnebago trickster. Decades ago, in the course of my academic studies on physical and social anthropology, I recall the eminent anthropologist Maurice Bloch, great nephew of the influential sociologist Emile Durkheim, who was on the faculty of my university, asking the following rhetorical question. If people in traditional societies do go about in a permanently mystical state, how is it they manage to deal efficiently with sophisticated worldly matters, such as systems of exchange, agriculture, caring for children, the rearing of livestock, building living accommodation, traveling long distances by land and sea, and all the other exigencies of everyday life? As already stated, doubts were cast on participation mystique from the start, and Levi-Bruhl himself conceded that primitive mentality was not pre-logical. As the academic Robert Siegel points out, for Levi-Bruhl, this was by far the more important aspect of primitive mentality than the mystical, and he never completely let go of the latter. In his notebooks published posthumously, Levi-Bruhl states, quote, "These minds do not differ from ours from the logical point of view, not only in the structure, but also in the manifestation of their activity," unquote. He went on to declare, quote, "When I used to say that primitive men do not perceive anything as we do, I should rather have said, do not perceive anything entirely as we do," unquote. Though Jung was aware that participation mystique was the object of criticism, he was still drawn to the term as it could be psychologized through linking it to projection, and as already stated, remains in usage by analytical psychologists. The heading of the next section is Bricolage. The doyen of 1950s Parisian intellectual life, Claude Lévi-Strauss, founder of the discipline known as structuralism, was also a critic of the term participation mystique. Although a whole generation separated Lévi-Strauss from Jung, the former being born in 1908 and dying in 2009 at the venerable age of 101, whilst the latter, Jung, was born in 1875, dying in 1961. The world in which they both existed was profoundly affected by the First World War. The end of this terrible conflict left in its wake a strong sense of the utter bankruptcy of Western civilization, which eventuated in the breakdown of given mores, and to each of these profound thinkers having to find his own path under the shadow of that devastating catastrophe. Furthermore, there was the advent of the Second World War, following the rise of Nazism and its accompanying credo of anti-Semitism. Quote, "Europe's violent colonizing project had rebounded on Europe itself, leading its practices and representations into savagery. Over time, this fully integrated violence had paved the way for Nazism," unquote. Ethnography up to the advent of Lévi-Strauss had been a colonial enterprise, giving rise to the kind of faulty assumptions of Levi-Bruhl, for which Lévi-Strauss's structural anthropology was an antidote. In this regard, it is worth noting that Levi-Strauss exonerates British colonial rule in India, comparing it favorably with his repugnance for French foreign policy. Excuse me, it's my condition. In stating the following, quote, 50 years of modest and patient research undertaken by a sufficient number of anthropologists could have led to outcomes in Vietnam and North Africa similar to those Britain has achieved in India, thanks at least in part to the scholarly work it has produced for a century. Excuse me, I have postnasal drip, so it makes me croak like that. It comes and goes. As a result of what was happening in Europe, Levi-Strauss spent the period from 1935 to 1947 in the Americas, partly doing field work in Amazonia and also living and working in New York, where his thinking was clearly impacted by the budding science of cybernetics. For example, the notion of binary opposites. What he discovered in the course of his sojourn in both regions was to dramatically affect his thinking about the social sciences, above all the discipline of anthropology. In the few years following his return to France in 1947, he completely changed the course of Parisian intellectual life from one based on philosophy, namely the philosophy of Sartre, to one based on the social sciences, i.e. what came to be known as structuralism. I just have some water, excuse me. One reason for creating this new discipline is best explicated in his own words as follows. Between the basic absurdity Fraser attributed to primitive practices and beliefs, and the specious validation of them in terms of a supposed common sense invoked by Malinowski, there is scope for a whole science and a whole philosophy. This new discipline of structuralism created by Levi-Strauss postulated that phenomena are intelligible through their interrelationship with each other. This claim is, of course, akin to Fernandez's view of structural linguistics, from which it derives, in postulating that signs are arbitrary and only acquire their meaning through their interrelations with others. For example, the interaction between the abstract concept of the sound image of the signifier and the object of that, i.e. the signified. A central claim of structuralism is that the human mind is composed of underlying intrinsic structures that guide all human action and are common to all humanity, despite cultural or historical differences. This, in a nutshell, was what Levi-Strauss meant when he coined the phrase, the savage mind. The term savage denoting a stratum of the universal mind. From this brief account of structuralism, it may be seen to share something in common with Jung's theory of archetypes, a result of which Levi-Strauss expended much energy on trying to distance himself from the latter. The reasons for this were manifold, including Levi-Strauss's view that Jung was a mystical, not helped by his enthusiastic endorsement of the term participation mystique, anti-Semite, both of which were anathema to Levi-Strauss. The latter being an atheist of Jewish origin, trying to create a system based on logic, with little room in it for affect or religion. Indeed, for a self-proclaimed Marxist, the latter would have been anathema. On the other hand, it is important to acknowledge that Levi-Strauss had a deep feeling for the sacred, which he found in indigenous culture, as well as in the arts and in music. And he was, in fact, a gifted musician and musicologist. Biographically, there are some striking resemblances between the two thinkers, with Levi-Strauss estranging himself from his family's Judaism, not dissimilar to the way Jung distanced himself from his pastor father's version of Christianity. Alongside his 1955 work, Tris Tropiques, detailing his Brazilian odyssey that created a sensation worldwide in the 1950s and 1960s, His book, The Savage Mind, took the anthropological world by storm. I am happy to say it was Levi-Straussian ideas that were preeminent during the time I was pursuing my academic studies in physical and social anthropology, as I first met him and was won over to that discipline while a student at the Sorbonne in the 1950s. It was the incomparable Merleau-Ponty, the phenomenological philosopher, who lucidly summarized structuralism, and in particular structural anthropology, as having the capacity, quote, to substitute relationships of complementarity for antinomies. Social facts are neither things nor ideas, they are structures, unquote. The point of structure being that it overcame any contradiction between an objectifying thought, i.e. that of the anthropologist, and that of indigenous thinking. The savage mind introduced the concept of the bricoleur, namely a jack of all trades, who in the course of tinkering uses whatever comes to hand, in contrast to the engineer who has to use specific tools for a given task. Bricolage is a way of thinking that is not fixed or centered and is instead flexible and inspiring of creativity and originality. In other words, the bricoleur is an innovator par excellence. Bricolage represents a model of intelligibility that is operative in Western society and coexists rather than contradicts other ways of thinking. Its dynamic is universal. In addition, bricolage is a powerful antidote against holistic conceptions of history, the latter strongly suggestive of a singular tree-like path of development. In this novel analytic methodology, history becomes a more flexible, many-voiced, and contested affair. And as a consequence, Levi-Strauss is anti-evolutionary in his thinking about societal development. Again, this is in striking contrast to the historical evolutionary approach embraced by Lévi-Brühl. Admittedly, his evolutionary thinking owing more to Herbert Spencer than to Charles Darwin. Inconveniently for Levi-Strauss in his dismissal of Jung, another huge area of interest they shared in common was the study of mythology, which for both thinkers was foundational for human functioning. For Levi-Strauss, a significant function of myth is the creation and ongoing underpinning of society and culture, and indeed the continued existence of society was viewed as being dependent on mythological validation. He utilized his newfound knowledge of binary opposites in his study of myths. In the end, both Levi-Strauss and Jung were criticized for being ahistorical. In actual fact, they both embraced this way of conceptualizing, which in Jung's case may well have been a part of the reason for his complete dismissal of Hegel's historical approach. On the contrary, Levi-Strauss brought his anthropological gaze to bear on the study of myth, aiming at the near universal elements of mythical thought, which consists of the human essence as the common denominator and universal characteristic of every society. One need hardly point out the similarity between his approach and Jung's archetypal thinking. The current presentation suggests that both thinkers were each other's complementary shadow, with Freud as the connecting link between them. Quote, Freud brilliantly demonstrated that our unreason had its reasons, which consciousness could not ensure. Now, Levi-Strauss has demonstrated in a profound and new way that the apparent chaos of primitive myths and rituals obeys a deeper order and principles that had remained invisible until now, unquote. Next section is Participation Mystique continued. An important component of Levi-Strauss's critique of Lévi-Bruhl's concept of primitive mentality was his claim that the latter had set up a false dichotomy between what he saw as scientific, logical, and traditional pre-logical mental functioning. Levi-Strauss states as follows, quote, "The savage mind is logical in the same sense, in the same fashion as ours, contrary to Lévi-Bruhl's opinion. Its thought proceeds through understanding, not affectivity, with the aid of distinctions and oppositions, not by confusion and participation," unquote. Furthermore, in Tristropique, he claimed Freudian psychoanalysis as one of his three intellectual mistresses, the other two being geometry and Marxism. In this presentation, I'm exploring some of the differences between what Levi-Strauss calls structure and Jung's key concept of archetype, and at the same time claiming they share as much in common as they do in opposition. I would go so far as to argue that Levi-Strauss's term structure owes more than he cares to admit to Jung's theory of archetypes, which it seems to me is the main reason he was critical of Jung and went to great lengths to distance himself from the latter's archetypal thinking. On Jung's part, I can produce no evidence that he knew anything about Levi-Strauss's work, as it does not feature in the general index of the collected works. There follows some of the critical comments Levi-Strauss used in being dismissive of Jung, as we can see from his statement that it is possible to, quote, "dispose of theories making use of the concept of archetypes or collective unconscious," unquote. He accuses Jung of attempting to find universal contents in his notion of the collective unconscious. But as Wolfgang Giegerick says of Jung's later thinking, quote, "He, Jung, is no longer concerned with any substance, any entity. He simply expresses the abstract notion of the oppositional structure or form of the psychic. What the opposites are is here not said, and it cannot, should not be said in the context of this latest work, Mysterium Conjunctionis, an inquiry into the separation and synthesis of psychic opposites in alchemy, because this would be a relapse into the substantiating style of thought that this title has long left behind. What Giegerick means by substantiating style is demonstrated in Jung's 1928 paper, quote, "The relation between the ego and the unconscious," published in 2 essays on analytical psychology. Intriguingly, the original title of this paper was La structure de l'inconscient. So much for the shadow side of their thinking. What Jung and Levi-Strauss share in common is the fact that they are criticized from within their own discipline as well as from outside of it. Levi-Strauss's detractors include Jean-Paul Sartre, Paul Ricoeur, Jacques Derrida, and the American cultural anthropologist Clifford Geertz, many of whose criticisms of structuralism resonate with those leveled at Jung's theory of archetypes, namely, that it is timeless, negates history, and deals with the universals of the human mind rather than with particular features of different cultures. What this chapter has so far argued, however, is that Levi-Strauss was in no way attempting to be historical, and was instead showing that the savage mind was ubiquitous as well as ahistorical and anti-evolutionary. The post-structuralists, for example, Deleuze, Foucault, Barthes, Derrida et al., distance themselves from Levi-Strauss's structuralist project, which sought to find universal similarities by their emphasis on difference, or différence, as Derrida has it. The next title is Collective Representations, Categories of the Imagination, Participation Mystique. In addition to this whole-scale borrowing from Levi-Strauss of Participation Mystique, which denotes, quote, an unconscious identity in which two individual psychic spheres interpenetrate to such a degree that it is impossible to say what belongs to whom, that's Jung. Lévi-Brühl was also a key source for Jung's concept of archetypes, as were the ideas of other French thinkers, such as Émile Durkheim's collective representations, and Henri Hubert and Marcel Mauss's categories of the imagination. Jung was informed about Durkheim through his reading of Lévi-Brühl, who had studied philosophy at the École Normale Supérieure, then went on to become a member of the Durkheimian school and an armchair anthropologist. In particular, it was Durkheim's concepts of collective consciousness and collective representations, largely reworked by Lévi-Brühl in his book, The Mental Functions in Inferior Societies, that were of major interest to Jung. The first concept, collective consciousness, denotes the beliefs and assumptions collectively held that individuals in a society unconsciously accept, whilst the second, quote, was made up of collective representations which expressed how the group thought of itself. That's from Shamdasani. As already stated, according to Lévi-Brühl, primitive, this term was in common usage at one time, but has been supplemented by more acceptable epithets in the thinking of anthropologists like Lévi-Strauss. Mental functioning was dominated by a different type of collective representation, what he called mystical, to the mental functioning of so-called civilized peoples. The next heading, archetypes, categories of the imagination, collective representations, participation mystique. The concepts highlighted above are represented in Jung's concept of the psychoid nature of the archetype, or as he puts it, unus mundus. The unitary world, quote, toward which the psychologists and the atomic physicists are converging along separate paths, unquote. He goes on to say, quote, the psychoid archetype has a tendency to behave as though it were not localized in one person, but were active in the whole environment. Animals and primitives have a particularly fine nose for these things, unquote. Furthermore, quote, as soon as the dialogue between two people touches on something fundamental, essential, and numinous, and a certain rapport is felt, gives rise to a phenomenon which Lévi-Brühl officially called participation mystique, unquote. As already stated, both Lévi-Brühl's collective representations and Hubert and Mauss's categories of the imagination were acknowledged by Jung to be influences on the development of his concept of the archetype as follows. Hubert and Mauss call them categories of the imagination. I have employed the concept of the collective unconscious to embrace all these archetypes. He goes on to say, quote, even if a neurosis has no cause at all other than imagination, it would nonetheless be a very real thing. What then shall we say to our patient with the imaginary cancer? I would tell him, yes, my friend, you are really suffering from a cancer-like thing. You really do harbor in yourself a deadly evil. However, it will not kill your body because it is imaginary, but it will eventually kill your soul, and will go on growing until it has swallowed your whole psychic existence, unquote. What Jung often terms psychic reality, he equates with imagination itself as a psychic process. Every psychic process is an image and an imagining. Otherwise, no consciousness could exist, and the occurrence would lack phenomenality. I just want to write a note for myself there. Right. What follows from this is that when Jung links up with what he understands Hubert and Mauss to be saying in categories of the imagination, he acknowledges that archetypal motifs play themselves out in the witchcraft beliefs of primitive mankind, which he finds, quote, very interesting and very sensible, actually more sensible than the academic views of modern science, unquote. He points out that this is to be seen at work in the demons of sickness that possess modern humankind, both physical and psychological. The reliance on categories of the imagination may seem convincing, but is in fact based on a faulty premise. as thinkers in the Durkheimian mold, such as Huber and Marx, thought of these a priori categories as socially, not psychologically constructed. Furthermore, when Jung buys into Lévi-Bruhl's participation mystique, he takes an opposing view and goes on to marvel at the striking difference between the pre-logical state of mind and, quote, our own conscious outlook. Though Lévi-Bruhl never claimed that modern thinking was free of mystical and pre-logical aspects. Jung cites witchcraft belief as a perfect example of that capricious way of explaining things, which is a characteristic of the pre-logical state of mind. That's Jung, not me. Although he concludes that, quote, primitive man is no more logical or illogical than we are, only his presuppositions are different. He does not examine his assumptions. To him, it is an unquestionable truth that disease and other ills are caused by spirits or witchcraft. Am I allowed to say something off the paper right now, or Isa, can I say something? I cut out a huge amount of material here because I was going to give a wonderful bit of a presentation on witchcraft by the great Evans Pritchard from the 20th century, where he's saying the opposite. And he was actually doing field work amongst these people. They do not see witchcraft as caused by spirits. They acknowledge that all kinds of disease and so on are caused by disease. And that witchcraft, they have a very interesting phrase for witchcraft, which is that it's the second sphere. So when somebody has a disease, it's not seen initially as caused by witchcraft. But witchcraft is prevalent in many tribal societies right across Africa, still is. So it is what they call the second spear, which I think is a very interesting way of putting that. Excuse me, sir, for going off the paper. In his reliance on armchair, you all right? Okay. In his reliance on armchair anthropologists like Lévi-Bruhl and James Fraser for material on traditionalist societies, Jung felt it was acceptable to come out with assertions of the following kind, quote, sensitive people will find it unpleasant when small things are compared with great. In fairness to the primitive psyche, however, I would like to emphasize that the holy dread of civilized man differs but little from the awe of the primitive, and that the God who is present and active in the mystery is a mystery for both. No matter how crass the outward differences, the similarity or equivalence of meaning should not be overlooked, unquote. It is the acquiescence on Jung's part deriving from his espousal of ideas, some dubious, as in the case with participation mystique, from the social sciences that is called into question, namely, that primitives live in a mystical state, ungrounded in the profane world. This was commonly held to be true at one time, so that primitives, psychotics, and children were portrayed as solely inhabiting a mystical realm. The concatenation of these different groupings has a considerable body of thinking behind it. Much of it would not be acceptable now. In Jung's case, he was well aware of the criticisms of Lévi-Bruhl's concept of participation mystique, but felt that because he thought it was psychologically valid, it was acceptable to go on using it. Jung's reliance on dubious ideas, uncritically borrowed from the social sciences, created problems that persist in Jungian psychology. The notion of primitives living in a mystical state, ungrounded in the profane world, was itself ungrounded in contemporary fieldwork. It connected Jung's psychology to understandings of non-European cultures as inferior, and by extension to a lineage of racist stereotypes that locate Northern Europeans at the top of an indefensible hierarchy. By placing primitive psychotics in children in the same mystical realm as implied by the concept of participation mystique, Jung relied on a body of thought that would not be deemed acceptable now. Jung was well aware of the criticism of Lévi-Bruhl's concept of participation mystique, but he continued to use it. Today, it is a deeply questionable point of view. The last bit is called Coda. A joint anthropology-psychology conference was held in 1998 at St. John's, Cambridge, to mark the centenary of the last great expedition embarked on by a group of anthropologists and psychologists titled the Torres Straits Expedition to the archipelagos situated between Australia and New Guinea. Members of this, do you want, something came on there, okay. Members of this expedition came from the discipline of anthropology and psychology, some individuals representing both, and it included A.C. Haddon, John Layard, William McDougall, C.G. Seligman, and W.H.R. Rivers. The 1998 Centenary Conference was part celebration, part mourning ritual to mark the passing of a time when these two great disciplines could still speak a similar language and collaborate closely together. We should leave the last word to one of the foremost anthropologists of the 20th century, Bronislaw Malinowski, as follows, quote, "We have developed a theory of the plasticity of instincts under culture and of the transformation of instinctive responses into cultural adjustment. On its psychological side, our theory suggests a line of approach which, while giving full due to the influence of social factors, does away with the hypotheses of, quote, group mind, quote, collective unconscious, quote, gregarious instinct, and similar metaphysical conceptions, unquote." That's from Malinowski. One can see from this that Malinowski is dismissive of one of Jung's signature theories of the mind. In similar fashion, he challenged Freud's theory of the Oedipus complex, particularly in relation to matrilineal societies in correspondence with Ernest Jones. Furthermore, Malinowski cast his critical eye on the conflicts between rival schools of psychoanalysis and thought anthropology should not align itself with any one of them. Given the ongoing tribal warfare in psychoanalysis, to which Jung himself contributed, one wonders what may have prompted the latter to dream of a unification theory overarching the spectrum of the sciences. Thank you.
Obrigado, Anne. Excelente apresentação. Acho que você abre para muitas questões interessantes. Eu havia te falado que antes da apresentação eu tinha 11 perguntas para fazer, né? Agora eu tenho 18. Pessoal, quem quiser perguntar.
I'm very glad to hear it. But I see we have 40 participants, so perhaps they have a question or two. But would you like to start by asking one, Marcus?
Vamos lá, pessoal. Quero começar, mas dizendo para o pessoal, quem quiser fazer a pergunta, coloca o nome no chat, eu chamo e a pessoa faz a pergunta. Anne, queria começar com uma questão sobre Jung e Lévi-Strauss. Eu venho de uma geração junguiana que, quando a gente foi ler o Pensamento Selvagem, do Lévi-Strauss, e o famoso capítulo A Eficácia Simbólica, era inevitável fazer uma associação entre a figura do xamã com a do analista. Essa associação do xamã como aquele que cura, que vai buscar as almas que estão fora do corpo para recuperar a saúde do membro da tribo, isso teria uma correspondência simbólica na figura do analista e o inconsciente. A minha pergunta para você é: essa associação ainda é válida? Ela ainda se faz possível? E como eu sei que você gosta muito da obra do Gygax, tomando como referência as ideias do Gygax, são campos de operação lógica possíveis de serem articulados ou não há como associar o xamã com o analista moderno, o psicoterapeuta moderno? Queria saber um pouco a tua opinião sobre isso.
I'm sorry, I don't quite understand the question. Can you just summarize that, Marcus? Thank you. Yeah.
Foi isso, eu não entendi. Isso. Só assim, curtinho, desse jeito? Tá bom. Tá bom, vai lá.
I didn't understand the question. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, briefly, yes. I mean, I have to say that where I did my anthropology was not particularly, when I did my, the academic study of anthropology, that was at London University, they were not particularly drawn to studying shamans and shamanistic cultures. So your knowledge of shamans, I'm sure, is much greater than mine. I have some idea of what it's about, but yes, I mean, I think that's as much as I know about shamans, there's quite an overlap, I think, between what the shaman does in his society. In fact, I've written. Now, where have I written that? I'm always writing. I've written a paper on a shaman from, I'm just trying to remember which tribal grouping in East Africa. It's very bad of me not to remember their name. And the shaman, this was done by an anthropologist in actually kind of mid to later 20th century. It's a very sympathetic account of how the shaman in that tribal group, I think it's the Ndembu, who are from, the tribal groups in Africa often cover many African countries because the border lines were drawn up quite arbitrarily by the colonial powers. But what the shaman was doing was what we would call psychotherapy. I don't know about psychoanalysis, but certainly psychotherapy. And it's a wonderful account. And I wrote it, and I'm trying to remember where I wrote it. I wrote that for Quadrant, I think, which is a New York publication some time ago, as a tribute to a friend of mine, a Jungian analyst who had died. And who had, is there, in one sense, is it more in some analysts than in others, I have to say, it's that shamanic quality. And I just want to add, if I may, a very interesting Jungian analyst, psychoanalyst from Australia, but he's also joined the group I'm with in New York, called John Merchant. He's written quite a lot on shamanistic practices, but it's not really my field, I have to say.
Lu, deixa eu só emendar uma pergunta aqui antes da sua, tá? Anne, a partir daquilo que a gente entende como o estruturalismo definido por Lévi-Strauss, você acha que seria possível dizer que, de alguma maneira, o Jung era um estruturalista, ou é possível fazer uma leitura estruturalista da psicologia junguiana?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you asked that, Marcus, because I was trying to keep my presentation to a certain length, obviously, for this evening. But I've written somewhere that Jung himself is a structuralist. And the reason I give for that is that Jung is not so interested in clearly defining concepts. He's much more interested in the interrelationship between concepts. And that is very much structuralist way of functioning. I don't think he got it from Lévi-Strauss. As far as I know, Lévi-Strauss is an unknown quantity to Jung, but I have no evidence one way or the other on that. But I think naturally, Jung is a phenomenologist and a structuralist thinker. Yeah. May I say some more, because this is a really important question. In other words, he is, in many ways, of course, as we know, very different to Freud. And one way in which he's very different to Freud is that Freud is the most wonderful conceptualizer. He clearly defines each one of his concepts. He's very keen to do that. And that's one of their great differences. You know, Jung's not interested in doing that. He kind of, when he's trying to define archetypes, he throws in a bit of Plato and a bit of Kant, you know, and a bit of the French thinkers. The French thinkers are actually quite a big influence on him. But you can make up your own mind exactly what archetypes mean as far as Jung concerned. Whereas Freud would have clearly defined what he meant by that important concept. I'm glad to see that I'm taking that as agreement, because I think so, don't you, Marcus? I think this is one of the really big differences between these two great thinkers.
Obrigado, Anne. Lu, contigo.
Oi, Anne, super obrigada pela sua palestra inteligentíssima, que eu fiquei aqui saindo fumaça para acompanhar e cheia de perguntas. Enquanto você falava das ciências sociais, eu me lembrei um pouco de algumas discussões que eu tive com alguns, na verdade, com a minha filha especificamente, que é estudante de ciências sociais, uma apaixonada estudante de ciências sociais, e a gente tem algumas discussões no sentido das diferenças entre psicologia e ciências sociais, né? E ela fica muito na linha de que são incompatíveis essas duas matérias, porque uma preza muito o social e o coletivo, e a psicologia muito o indivíduo. E eu tendo a discordar um pouco disso, mas eu fiquei pensando se a gente não podia colocar a individuação como um momento de intersecção dessas duas matérias, por exemplo, né? E outra coisa que eu lembrei, enquanto você falava das ciências sociais, foi do livro do Hillman, dos 100 anos de psicoterapia, que ele ressalta, né, que a psicanálise tem feito isso, de prezar muito o indivíduo. Queria saber um pouco sua opinião sobre todas essas coisas.
Thank you, Luciane. I think you're asking about 6 questions in one. So I'll try and unravel them as best I can. I mean, you're touching on something that I'm very interested in, which is how, I mean, the thing with psychoanalysis, whether it's Jungian or Freudian, it's extremely difficult to position it exactly anywhere, because it encompasses whole worlds within, whether it's Freudian or Jungian. It is, I mean, for one thing, I've argued, because a very close friend and colleague of mine who died recently, who's a philosopher of science, I've argued that with him, he's an American, was an American, that psychoanalysis is actually capable of being put in the hard sciences, and what has kept it out from being considered as a hard science is the lack of data. Psychoanalysts, until quite recently, have produced very little data to support, for instance, with Freud, the all-important theory of repression, which lends itself quite easily to an epidemiological survey. And that would, that we could then position psychoanalysis of every variety in the sciences, not just in the social sciences. The social sciences, every social science that I've come across, whether it's anthropology, psychology, or sociology, most of them want to be science. It's considered science, full stop. They don't want the social bit. And again, they make quite valid arguments in favor of that. And psychoanalysis most certainly could be validated as a hard science, but it's simply, so far, apart from some of the wonderful work that Peter Fonagy and Mary Tarshi are doing, Mark Solms, who's incredible, doing incredible work. We've now developed, which I think Marcus mentioned in introducing me, we've developed a new discipline called neuropsychoanalysis. And there we're bringing together neuroscience and psychoanalysis. Mark is, of course, a contemporary Freudian, but I'm a London Jungian, so we use a lot of mainstream psychoanalytic theory and practice in the way that we function. So I'm very familiar with classical Freudian, contemporary Freudian, Kleinian, Bionian, you name it. So I'm answering you in a rather roundabout way, but you get my point, that actually these psychoanalysis of whatever hue, Kleinian or classical Freudian, contemporary Freudian, Jungian, actually could come under the heading of a hard science. But because, we hide behind our position of what we call confidentiality in not producing data. And we could actually be doing that with epidemiologies for quite a lot of the psychoanalytic concepts. I can't remember if you asked me anything else. I'm sticking mainly to the social science and science part of your contribution. Did you ask me something else that I haven't answered, Luciana?
Na verdade, eu perguntei também se você acha que a gente pode dizer que a individuação do Jung, o conceito de individuação, pode ser uma intersecção entre as ciências sociais e a psicologia. Não.
No, I never ever use that term, ever. It doesn't belong in my way of thinking. Being an individual, sure, but I don't care for Jung's. I don't know what the heck he means by it. I don't use it. And no, I don't, and it certainly would not act as a bridge to any science, social science or hard science, no. I'm trying to think from Jung, what would complexes, I think, would be very amenable. And in fact, when we formed the Neuropsychoanalytic Society in 2000, 22 years ago in London, I put this forward because there were a lot of neuroscientists there who were interested in psychoanalysis, and they were talking about, how can psychoanalysis become join up with neuroscience, because from the face at that time they were far apart, because it was mainly cognitive neuroscience that people were looking at. Once we moved to affective neuroscience, we then had a bridge to psychoanalysis, and that is the bridge. Affect is the bridge. Complexes are the bridge. All these affect and complexes are very amenable to being to epidemiological surveys. Now, those would be, for me, the bridges. Individuation, I never use myself. Excuse me for saying that. Anybody else interested? No?
Anne, pegando carona na pergunta da Luciana, o conceito de complexos culturais poderia funcionar melhor nessa zona de vizinhança entre as ciências sociais e a teoria junguiana?
I'm not interested in the social sciences. I'm looking more at the sciences now. I come from a social science background, anthropology, but at least academically, I've been in the psychoanalytic world for more than 50 years. But complexes would lend themselves extremely well to epidemiological surveys, and that's basically what you have to conduct if you're going to claim to be a serious science. And that would be very easy to study. You go around asking people about their complexes. I mean, we all have complexes. So there'd be nobody in the whole world who wouldn't have a complex. So this could be a universal epidemiology. I don't know who would have the time to do it, because it would be a very big piece of bit of research. That I would put forward as probably for Jungian psychoanalysis, the best concept to put forward. Dreams, Mark Soms has already done some very, very interesting work, scientific work on where dreams are produced in the brain. And this is absolutely fascinating. What he's done is to show that we're not dreaming only in the course of REM sleep. It used to be thought that was the only time we were dreaming. And he's showing, I can't go into the details because it's very complex. The brain, as you know, is such a complex organ. But he's showing exactly what parts of the brain are active when we're dreaming, and that's not just in REM sleep. Now, how about that for a bit of scientific research, right? Underpinning dreams. And I mean, Jung is all the time talking about dreams. The reason I don't mean to be discourteous, but the reason I dismiss individuation is that I am very much a London Jungian, just as Andrew is. You had Andrew on recently, I think. And now when you have Heiyong Shen, or Shen Heiyong as it should be in Chinese, in a couple of weeks, then you will have much more of a classical Jungian. He'd love to talk about individuation. I like Young very much. We have a lot of discussions about this kind of thing, because he's got used to me now, but he used to find it a bit. He couldn't think that I was a Jungian because I'm always quoting Bion and Freud and Winnicott and Klein and talking in terms of projective identification, things like that. Sorry, I talk too much. Somebody ask a question.
Pessoal, por favor, hein? Sem inibições sintomáticas. Vamos lá fazer as perguntas. Fica à vontade. Anne, vou mudar um pouco de assunto.
Yes.
E vou pegar um pouco da tua biografia. Você trabalhou muitos anos, me parece, com Michael Fordham, né? Dentro do ambiente.
I wouldn't say that quite. Michael, I knew, yes, I did spend. Did you want to know something about Michael?
Eu tinha duas perguntas. Primeiro, que você pudesse nos dizer o que foi o cenário junguiano de Londres e essa espécie de conflito entre Michael Fordham e Gerhard Adler. Como é que você localiza isso? Peraí, tem uma outra.
Yes, I will. Did Andrew talk about this? Did Andrew talk about it? No, because Andrew and I, we did so much work together trying to create bridges between all these warring Jungians. You ask Andrew, and really, okay, Michael Fordham. Michael, I knew Gerhard much better, although I'm much more in the Michael Fordham school of thinking. But I knew Gerhard very well. The reason I nearly actually trained with the British Psychoanalytic Society. And I was actually thinking seriously of moving to the British Psychoanalytic Society, not training as a Jungian, once I came out of psychiatry. And so I then decided to stay in the Jungian world because of Gerhard and Hella Adler, who many decades ago were the most important amongst the most important Jungians in the world, because they had worked closely with Jung, with Emma, with Yolanda Jacobi, all the people that I really was interested in. And so they asked if I would, work with them and join their society. So at that time, I decided, as life had brought me to a Jungian analyst when I first started analysis, it seems to me a very important thing to stay and work through to the end of anything that life brings you. And I was brought to the Jungian world, so I decided to stay in the Jungian world, train with but as a London Jungian. Having said that, I would say that for me, one of the greatest of all the analytical psychologists ever is Michael Fordham. And I could speak for about an hour about Michael Fordham. All for kinds of reasons. Michael was I'm very invested in psychiatry. I love the work I did there. Michael was a psychiatrist, terribly important. But also he had a great intellect, really first-rate intellect. He was a thinker, an extroverted thinker, if we use Jung's typology, not like Wolfgang, who's an introverted thinker. Michael invested his thinking in creating societies, journals. He was wonderful at that, and he was a really wonderful thinker. But I'm an introverted thinker, so I'm much more in the Wolfgang's way of functioning. But I have the greatest respect for Michael Fordham. He and Wolfgang are, for me, and James Hillman. I came to love James Hillman very much as a person. we became very close. At first, he didn't like me, and I didn't like him, because he thought I was a typical London ego Jungian, which is very funny, which in a way I am, of course. But we just got to like each other so much that we kind of forgot about our cultural differences. And we just got on so well. And I miss him terribly. James Hillman was one of the great personalities of the Jungian world. I shall miss him forever. So I'm very broad, I didn't terribly like Michael Fordham as a person. He was a bit cold. But he was very generous with me. He gave me a lot of time, because the Journal of Analytical Psychology asked me to write about the warfare that had gone on, what I call the Jung Wars that went on in the 1970s. And so I interviewed all the people, who were involved in that. Michael gave me the whole day of his time. I went to his home in the country. We spent the day together, and he was very open and honest about his thoughts about what happened. And it was real warfare between different Jungian thinkers. I'm surprised Andrew didn't. I guess Andrew's always on to the next thing. He's wonderful. He's always thinking about something else. But Andrew and Renos Papadopoulos and I, we worked together so much to try to build bridges between these warring factions, and particularly in London, of course, but in the UK, but it was mainly in London. And we did what we could to get them to just talk to each other. I mean, they wouldn't even talk to each other for a long time. It was terrible, the antagonism. But I've written about that in the Journal of Analytical Psychology somewhere. Do any of the participants want to ask anything? Are they inhibited? Or?
Sônia, não quer fazer uma, Sônia? Andréia Cunha, Sônia. Vou começar a chamar pelo nome, hein? Geni. Tatiana. Samuel. Sônia, quer fazer, Sônia?
Yeah.
Quero.
Por favor.
Muito obrigada pela palestra.
Hello.
Muito interessante, muito bom. E eu tenho uma pergunta que é assim, a gente tem hoje uma certa procura em encontrar o que seria a psicologia brasileira, a volta às raízes, né? E uma pergunta que sempre me cai, assim, quando as pessoas falam, dessa herança europeia que a gente tem, no sentido de que a própria psicologia, a antropologia são europeias, né? Então, como é que fica quando a gente procura essa... Né? Eu não sei se cabe aqui, mas me ocorreu isso. Se puder me falar um pouco, agradeço. Obrigada.
Yes, I'd love to. Sonia, this is a question I raised because I've taught and lectured in so many parts of the world. And I find myself saying to people, why are you not using your myths? Why are you using Greek myths? Because those are European. At the moment, I mean, everywhere I go, I say, in Brazil, you've got fantastic material, that you can be using from Amazonia. Tree, for instance, if you read that, I quoted Levi Strauss's great book, Tree. And he just loved working, one of the great books in anthropology, let me think, the Yanomamo from Amazonia, by an American anthropologist called Napoleon Chagnon. And when Chagnon,
Sim, já vi Copenhagen.
he's amongst the Yanomamo. The whole world fell in love with the Yanomamo because of Chagnon's work. That was in the, let me think, the in early 1970s, I read it. And we all fell in love with the Yanomamo and the things that Chagnon showed from them. Also, of course, you have the great, because of my age, I get problems sometimes with names, you know, they come and sometimes they don't come. But up in the north of Brazil, that wonderful part where you have the Yoruba,
Salvador, Bahia.
Not Bahia, no, further north, San Salvador up in the north, where you have the Yoruba, connection, and there are all kinds of wonderful things from there that can be used in psychoanalysis. I say this when I go to Japan, and they don't understand what I'm saying. I'm saying to them, why are you using Greek myths when that's European? And you've got fantastic myths in Japan. And I say this when I go to Russia. I haven't been to Russia recently for obvious reasons, but, you know, when I go to other part, I mean, Europe is different, but I go to Egypt a lot, I used to. South Africa, where I lectured, did some lecturing. Yes, from Brazil, you've got fantastic indigenous mythology, people that you, if you write about them from the Jungian point of view, it would be incredible, really incredible. I'm not Brazilian, so I can't do that. But I know a little bit from my anthropological background, especially the Yanomamo, especially what Levi-Strauss was writing about Amazonia, and from being in Brazil myself. I didn't actually go, I went to Brasilia. That's the only part of Amazonia I went to was Brasilia. So I don't know, you know, I don't know, what is that large city in Amazonia? No. Yes, Manaus. I thought it was Manaus. And I thought I got it wrong. Manaus. I was there for a wedding about 25 years ago. I was in Bahia. And some of the wedding party went to Manaus, and I had to come back to London because at that time I was doing a lot of administrative work for a big, I was the president of a big organization in London. And so I had to leave as soon as the wedding was finished, but I would really have loved to do that. And I didn't have the time to do it. Yes, I 100% agree with you, Sonia. Use your Brazilian indigenous material or the Yoruba material that you get from San Salvador, or the Hispanic, you know, material that you have going back to what, the 16th century, right? When was Brazil? Sorry, Portuguese you are, aren't you? I'm, by the way, two of my great grandparents are Portuguese. My family name was La Chavez.
Ah, é? Olha só.
Yeah, so I have Portuguese. I have Portuguese descent as well as English. Yeah. But yes, I 100% agree with you, Sonia. Use the Brazilian material. And, you know, if every part of the world was contributing its mythology, its indigenous material to Jungian analysis, it would be wonderful. Instead of always Greek myths. I mean, you know, we all know the Greek myths. They're fantastic too, but we want to know Brazilian myths.
Sim. Obrigada.
Anne, você acha que existe
yes.
um etnocentrismo junguiano, então?
A Jungian what?
Etnocentrismo.
Yes, and I got you. It's I don't want to keep criticizing the Jungians. You know, I do quite a lot of that, but I think it's just become, you know, psychoanalysis. What I say to people, I go to many parts of the world, obviously not for the last 2 years, like everybody else. I've been, you know, I had to stay home. But, you know, psychoanalysis, we have to remember, is a European creation. And so therefore, you know, Freud's using, you know, the Oedipal myth as the foundation myth for psychoanalysis. And basically, it remains, I think, quite a European enterprise. I wouldn't say ethnocentric, because that sounds as though Jungians are kind of, you know, just totally complete, you know, unaware of other cultures. That's not so at all. But is actually that the whole world, having, you know, found psychoanalysis of use or of interest, has swallowed European psychoanalysis instead of taking some things from psychoanalysis and merging it with their own cultures. And that would be so much more interesting. It would enrich psychoanalysis, apart from anything else, enormously.
Perfeito, perfeito. Sônia, quer fazer uma pergunta, Sônia Abate? Não? Deixa eu retomar uma questão, Anne. Feitiçaria. Você acha que a gente poderia pensar que a feitiçaria seria um retorno do animismo? Como a filósofa Isabel Stengel.
Oh, that's a wonderful question. Yeah, because as I'm sure you know, I'm going to blank again on a name. Oh, David Chalmers. Does the name David Chalmers mean anything?
Não conheço.
David Chalmers he's a philosopher, and he's also a neuroscientist. And Chalmers has been studying for many years, and so all the other neuroscientists in the whole world are studying what he calls the hard problem of consciousness, because they can't locate, they don't know where it is in the brain, they can't find it in the brain, and they can't understand why one species of animals, i.e. humans, develop consciousness and no other species of animals did. But they can't find it in the brain. Where is it? What is it? Why is it? And so Chalmers has become very well known. He is from Australia originally, but now he's at NYU in New York. And he was studying it scientifically, and he gave up. He said, I can't answer scientifically. So what he's doing now, he's returning to animism. And he's saying everything has consciousness. You know, rocks have consciousness. You know, this is what animism is, isn't it? You know, everything has consciousness. And so Chalmers is going back to, he has a special word for it. Oh Lord. Anyway, it's animism. And he's now also branching out into metaverse, which I don't know if metaverse is a big thing in Brazil, but it's becoming a big thing worldwide. But consciousness, because scientists cannot, you see, science can't answer every question. We as analysts, we know that. But scientists don't know that. So they are trying to find in the brain, where is consciousness, where to locate it in the brain, and they can't do that, right? So now they're having to find to look at non-scientific ways. So they're looking, like Chalmers, he's looking at animism. He's creating his own new version of animism. Yes, so it's very much around, very topical as a way of trying to explain consciousness. Yeah.
Lu?
Primeiro eu queria fazer um comentário sobre a coisa das mitologias mais localizadas, né, as brasileiras e tal. Eu fiquei pensando, eu sei que você não quer muito criticar os junguianos, que você já faz muito isso, mas tem aquele seu capítulo no livro Psicanálise Junguiana, que você fala sobre a formação, né, um pouco sobre o currículo. Eu acho que é um pouco engessado, né? Esse é o meu comentário. A gente acaba ficando engessado por causa do currículo. Então, assim, os institutos, eles não têm muita flexibilidade, né, de trazer isso na formação. Teria que ser cursos outros, né? Depois eu queria que você comentasse isso, se você quiser, mas a minha pergunta, eu queria voltar um pouquinho lá para o começo da tua palestra. Pode falar, pode falar. Quer responder essa primeiro? Pode falar.
Yeah. Oh, no. I think I addressed that already in my presentation. I'm very critical of the trainings. I say it all the time. I'm very critical of the trainings, not just the ones that I quoted from, from unfree associations, but all the trainings I think are they're too. They don't open up to other disciplines. They don't open up sufficiently to other cultures. They're very, very restricted, and then because of that, psychoanalysis is suffering. We are not getting so many training candidates because they can see for themselves that psychoanalysis has somehow not really, stayed up to date. And this is why we have founded neuropsychoanalysis. And we started that in London, but at the moment it's really probably the main center of it is in New York. Mark Soms himself is from South Africa. So there we've opened up to neuroscience, and where there's very, very interesting work being done. If any of you are interested, check it out online. You'll see that there's a neuroscience website where you can register for talks, or just actually have a look at one of Mark Som's videos. Those of you, I'm not sure, he comes to Brazil, by the way. He certainly, I saw Mark in Rio. I'm trying to remember when that was. 2005, I think, was the last time I saw Mark in Rio. He was presenting at the Copacabana, what's it called, that big hotel on Copacabana Palace. Palace, yes, that's the most. It's incredible. He was presenting there. So yeah, I think I do quite a lot of Jung bashing myself, but I also at the same time. Nowadays, actually, I just call myself a psychoanalyst because I'm using so many different disciplines in the way that I work, because I model for each patient. I'm responding to the patient. I'm not being a Jungian. If that patient needs a more Kleinian approach, more Winnicottian approach, more Bionian approach, or even just a very broad approach altogether. So for me, each patient is an individual. I don't use the term individuation, but an individual. That is what counts for me. And may I just contribute something from China, which is happening there, which I think is so wonderful. We hear so many bad things coming out of China, but I'm working several times a week online with China. I've been to China a few times. Obviously, I haven't been able to go for the last 2 years. But what they're starting in China now is they're introducing psychoanalysis into kindergarten schools. The children are being taught psychoanalysis, the teachers are being taught psychoanalysis, and the parents are being taught psychoanalysis. This is kindergarten. I think that's fantastic. How do you want to?
Sim. Eu queria voltar lá para o comecinho da sua palestra, quando você estava falando do termo primitivo, e eu me lembrei de algumas discussões que eu já tive aqui com alguns junguianos, né, que alguns junguianos consideram o termo primitivo racista, outros não consideram, falam que era o Jung na sua época, usando a linguagem que ele podia. Eu queria saber um pouco sua opinião sobre este termo relacionado com o racismo.
Oh, yeah, well, it was. Yeah, it was, yes. I mean, I addressed some of that, I hope, in my presentation today. I wouldn't, personally, what I've heard about Jung, particularly from people like Gerhard and Hella Adler, I wouldn't, well, let me tell you about something that happened. I was asked about what do you call it? An accusation that had been made against Jung at the inquest following the Second World War. And it was an accusation that came from a Jewish man in New York, accusing Jung of being a racist, of being a Nazi sympathizer, and an anti-Semite, right? And it basically was rubbish. I mean, I think Jung made some very unfortunate choices in the 1930s. There's no doubt about that. He is Germanic, after all. And just the philosopher that I'm most interested in at the moment is Heidegger. And I'm sure you all know that Heidegger was actually a Nazi. Jung, I don't think, was ever anywhere near being a Nazi, but I think he was rather seduced by the kind of mythology, the symbols, you know, because the Nazis modeled themselves on ancient Rome. You know, they had all like the eagles, you know, they had that they would hold up in front of their troops. All kinds of things they took from the ancient Romans, and including this mythology of back to what we were asking earlier, Marcus, about the shaman. You know, I think for Heidegger and for a lot of Germans, Hitler was a shaman, the great, you know, shamanistic leader that was going to save Germany, because Germany was in a terrible state in the 30s, after the First World War. And I think Jung got a little bit perhaps seduced by that kind of mythological side of the Nazi movement. And they had a certain glamour, you know, in the 30s. But no, he was asked if he would analyze Hitler, if you go to Berchtesgaden and analyze Hitler, and he refused. He never met Hitler. But he was, of course, a member of the Goering Institute, and he wrote some rather unfortunate things while he was a member of that. And Goering was a cousin of the, you know, Goering, and very much a Nazi. You know, my own personal tendency is not so much go around judging people. I will put forward, you know, certain quotations from them, as I did in the presentation, and say, no, I don't agree with that. But that at the same time, I would not call Jung a racist. I would not call anyone a racist, because it seems to me that the more we call people racists or terms like that, what we're doing is projecting our own shadow. It's much easier to see, the shadow in somebody else. And I write a lot about shadow and the need to integrate shadow, which is what my book that's going to be published soon in Texas is about, integrating shadow. So I tend not to go around accusing people of being racist or sexist or, all the other ists and isms that are around at the moment, because I come from India myself. So of course I have strong feelings about, I have, many, India is a part of me. And so I certainly object if anybody, makes any bad comments about India or even Pakistan. But no, I wouldn't see analytical psychology or Jung as racist. I think there's an unawareness, which is what I was pointing to at the beginning of my paper, about terms like participation, mystique, or terms like primitive, which of course even anthropologists used to use at one time. It wasn't meant to be a derogatory term. We are all primitive. We all have, at least I hope we all have, still alive in us, that primitive side, which is what we, to use another term, is what we call the unconscious. And that's our kind of animal, instinctual, primitive side. And we need that. We can't just function from the cerebral cortex, can we? From ego consciousness. That would be very shallow. As I said, I really don't judge people. It's not my way of functioning at all. Never has been. I come from an old colonial family in India, and I was brought out of India to London when I was 13, which was a very interesting time to leave your motherland and have to adapt to another culture, which is what London meant for me. It was a completely different culture to the one I came from. And so because of that, I think I kind of feel I don't identify with any particular nationality. I call myself British Indian, that's my identity. But I have very large extended family that includes Yoruba, and also I have a very large Black American extended family. So it's sometimes people can be prejudiced out of ignorance, because they don't know. I mean, for instance, I was communicating with someone in another part of England, a rather rural part of England, and in an email he referred to the Japanese as the Japs, which is a very derogatory term. And I tried to point that out to him, but he just had this. He was stuck back in the 1940s, when the Japanese were the enemy. But that's a very long time ago. Everybody has prejudices. We all do. We all have complexes. We all have prejudices. It's a question of how much we enact them, I think, probably. Anyway, I don't know if I've responded satisfactorily to what you were saying. No, I don't think that Jungians are racist, no, any more than anybody else is.
Muito satisfatório, obrigada.
Oh, thank you, Luciana. That's very kind of you. I thought I was sort of rambling a bit, but these are I know these are topical subjects right now. And because of what happened in the United States last year, I realized that, and you know, interestingly enough, my Black American family were the least disturbed by what happened, which was a very interesting phenomenon, because I have a large Black extended family from St. Louis. And so I communicated with them, and that terrible thing happened in America last year. And they said, well, you know, we're used to it, we're used to being, you know, treated a certain way by policemen in the United States, but it's changing, and, you know, things will change gradually in the United States. Because a lot of my extended family in St. Louis descend, like most Black Americans, from slaves. They came up the Mississippi from Mobile, Alabama, which is the deep South, and they formed a community in St. Louis. And so they know, you know, that their ancestors were slaves. They know about prejudice because the deep South still has a lot of anti-Black feelings, you know. But they've learned to live with it, and they don't hate white people, not at all. And so it's experience, really, isn't it? You know, like I've been in Brazil several times because I love Brazil. And so I actually know little bits about Brazil, whereas someone who hasn't been to Brazil just has a kind of fantasy about it. That's why I travel a lot. I travel a lot, mostly for work, and I used to go around, you know, lecturing and teaching and talking to people and getting to know, and always on my own. I really like to meet the people. I don't want to be with other English people or British people. If I'm in Russia, I want to be with Russian people. I used to go to Russia at one time, and obviously for obvious reasons, not recently, but to China, I was only with Chinese people every time I've gone there. Japan, except for the IAP Congress in Kyoto, which was about 6 years ago. Otherwise, I'm just with Japanese people. And that way you get to know people, you get to know the culture a bit. And they accept me because I'm the same wherever I go. And I know for Japanese, I'm considered a bit outspoken because I'm a woman. But I say, I'm sorry, I'm me. You know, I understand how it is for Japan that women shouldn't be like I am, but that's me. And they say, that's fine, we got used to you. Anyway, you tell me when you want me to go away, because it's so enjoyable being with all of you. I don't want to outstay my welcome.
Anne,
yes.
A gente está em cima da hora. Eu queria te agradecer pela tua participação aqui.
Oh, yes.
Seu depoimento foi muito gentil. Ele abarca uma gama de interesses muito largo. Antropologia do Levi-Strauss, psicanálise, Michael Fordham, Gigres, racismo, multiculturalismo. Queria te agradecer muito, mas eu queria te fazer uma última pergunta. Bob Dylan é uma imagem arquetípica do self?
I'm very wary of using the term self because I'm a London Jungian. Bob Dylan, as far as I'm concerned, is the archetypal image of everything. I think he's the greatest. I mean, I've loved Bob Dylan since I was in my early 20s, and I will go on loving him forever. What he did for us in the 60s was so fantastic. Yeah, but yes, I would agree, I think. I don't usually use the term self in the Jungian sense, but yes, I agree with you. I think Dylan is the incarnation of what Jung would mean by the self. Yeah. And I think he's the greatest individual. ever lived.
Só para deixar claro para as pessoas, a Anne me mandou uma foto dela com o livro do Carpani, né? Esse livro, e lá atrás, na biblioteca dela, tinha uma foto do Bob Dylan. Eu falei, olha, o Bob Dylan lá numa foto. Eu perguntei para ela, está respondido. Anne, muito obrigado por você estar aqui
Thank
comigo.
you. It was a great pleasure being with all of you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Espero
Isa,
que a
thank
gente...
you for your translation. Thank you, Marcus, for your interesting questions, and Luciana and Sonia. And it was a great pleasure being in Rio, even online. I just wish I could be there in person. I love it so much. So
Espero que em breve a gente possa se rever presencialmente e te dar um grande abraço. Tá bom? Obrigado pela tua gentil presença.
I hope so.
Pessoal, obrigado.
And give my best to Hae-Yong in 2 weeks when you have him. You love him. He's so good. Okay. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you, Isa. Thank you, Marcus. Thank you, Luciana. Thank you, Sonia. Bye-bye, Rio.
Obrigada.
Buona notte, is that right? Have I got that
Pessoal,
right?
obrigado pela presença de todos. Encontro
Is it?
fantástico
Okay.
com a Anne.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Muito afetuoso, muito carinhoso, muito inteligente. Espero que vocês tenham gostado, tá bom? Semana que vem, estamos de volta. Luciana.
Magali Villa-Lobos.
Magali Villa-Lobos.
Uma introdução ao volume 1 da obra completa de Rafael Lopes Pedraza.
Sexta-feira, 4 horas, tá bom? Boa sexta-feira, bom feriado. Ouçam Bob Dylan e até a próxima. Tá? Até lá, pessoal.
Até lá.